Unemployment, bankruptcy, homelessness, a global economic crisis. Should we be optimistic or pessimistic about our global economic recovery? Exploring the impact and seeking solutions, United Nations University presents UNU Conversation Series, The Economic Crisis.
Welcome to this edition of the UNU Conversation Series on the economic crisis, organized in connection with the June 2009 UN Conference on the World Financial and Economic Crisis and its impact on development. I am Jean-Marc Coicot from the United Nations University. With us here today in the studio at the UN, we have Robert Johnson, who is on the Commission of Experts of the President of the UN General Assembly on the reform of the international monetary and financial system. Mr. Johnson is a former chief economist of the US Senate Banking Committee and was also a managing director at Soros Fund Management. And he's here with us today to talk about some key issues which are at the core of the financial crisis. And more specifically, we're going to talk about the questions of having to do with regulation. So, Mr. Johnson, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. And just as a way to start our conversation, in your view, what were some of the key shortcomings in the regulatory system that enabled the financial crisis?
Okay, we'll start with the banks themselves.
Yes.
The big banks had too much leverage, and they had complex products. Many of these credit derivatives and other things, which created confusion. When the housing market turned down, the complexity of these products, which people cannot analyze, they can spend a month, but they don't know what they're worth, scared everyone because everybody felt when they lend to another bank, that bank is bankrupt.
Yes.
Or maybe it's bankrupt, but I can't tell. So it created caution, and it created a freeze-up of the credit markets. Now, why did we get to this place of leverage and complexity? The first thing is a failed economic philosophy. The free market fundamentalism, as they call it, that prevailed in the United States and was espoused by Alan Greenspan, who was our chief regulator, did not accurately represent all the things that are going on in the market. And my chairman, Stiglitz of our commission, has made a career of looking at what happens when there are market failures and what are their consequences. And he would never have adopted that free market fundamentalist perspective. But another thing that happened was the very powerful banks, with this ideology of free market, unrestricted behavior, doing what they wanted, knew they were powerful and knew that if they got into trouble, the government would bail them out. But knowing they would be bailed out, knowing that the downside would be cushioned by the authorities, encouraged them to take more and more risk until they built a bubble so big it collapsed.
So in a way, you are saying that the authorities and the philosophy that the authorities had contributed to partly create the crisis.
That's right. You had a confluence of powerful people making money, the economic philosophy, which was aided and abetted with consulting contracts, prestigious chairs at universities, all kinds of awards, and legislators who make the regulations, all depending on campaign contributions. So the wealthy and the powerful got the ideas and the money made the legislation. They appointed regulators who were consistent with this philosophy, which really emanated from the day that Ronald Reagan was elected. And we built this mountain of risk. And when it fell down...
But why has this philosophy been so powerful while once a while it failed and the government had to somehow come to the rescue?
Well, the
isn't it a bit
kept
surprising?
coming to the rescue, but the powerful people didn't change being powerful. And it was only in the extreme consequence of the current crisis that the costs, $800 billion U.S. bailout, IMF estimates $4 trillion in losses, world output lost, they estimate is $7 to $10 trillion. So when you lose $15 trillion, then the world has to stand up and take notice. And that's where we are now, though the powerful U.S. financiers are trying to say that the mistake was made, there's no need to change anything, back to business as usual.
But it's an entirely self-serving approach. So why is it that, and it's probably a naive question, why is it that an entirely self-serving approach becomes the philosophy, if not of the nation, at least of the government, and of successive governments? Why?
A small segment of people got very, very wealthy. A small segment of the media maintained its power. Advertising revenue coming from big banks is very high. And a small segment of the legislature stayed in power because money became so important for political campaigns because of the media marketing dimension of that. So you had a system that did not respond to the pains or the contradictions because the people who were in control of the system could benefit from keep going.
And this is something which happened regardless of who is in power, Republicans or Democrats.
No, it's a structural problem.
So it's beyond the political divide.
Yes, though I would say, to be fair, the Bush administration would beat their breast enthusiastically. The Obama administration seems slightly conflicted about these things. They aren't quite so brazen in their endorsement of the free market.
And yet the people who are advising the administration are, to a certain extent, the ones who called for deregulation in the late 90s.
That's correct.
So once again, can you tell us a bit how it works and why are we at this point having the ones who are partly responsible for the crisis advising for how we could get out of the crisis?
Well, I would say they are, those people, a reflection of the power that existed through the Reagan years, that existed during the Clinton years, and existed with great vigor in the Bush years. And society hasn't changed. I agree with you, the circumstances change very markedly and calls for very different minds, particularly people who are not defensive about what's happened in the past. The current group around Obama, which are largely the Clinton administration holdovers, are very defensive about what they created in the past in light of this crisis. And I don't think that's helpful.
So you feel that they are very defensive, and yet do you feel that they have a sense of responsibility for what has happened?
Depends on the individual. I think some would accept responsibility. As a matter of fact, Alan Greenspan himself has said, I have made mistakes. I didn't believe that unregulated institutions would act this recklessly. So ironically, perhaps the most conservative Republican of all is the person who's accepted most responsibility.
But we haven't heard this on the Democrat side.
No.
How do you explain this state of affairs? Why such reluctance to recognize one's mistakes?
It might be because they're in power. Greenspan has retired, and he felt it was honorable to maintain his, how we say, integrity by admitting an error and accepting responsibility. Those who are in power never want to diminish themselves.
I was going to ask you, it was going to be my second question, how do we reconcile what is at stake and the identity of government and what is at stake and the identity of the financial sector? But in a way you are telling us that this, there is a very high level or deep level of intrication, of integration even, between these two domains.
That's right.
So
the notion that markets and government are separate or
is a mythology.
Yes, it's a mythology. And what I would say is where the financial sector is most socially complicit, or what people would call evil, is in their efforts to manipulate the rules that govern themselves. People say in a capitalist democracy that the capitalism derives its moral legitimacy from being governed by democracy.
Yes.
But when the rules governing capitalism are bought and sold like commodities, it destroys that legitimacy.
So tell us a bit how it works, and also, why is it that people who are the custodian of the national wealth, if you will, who are meant to be committed to public service and to the welfare of people, why is it that they end up becoming the captives of special interest? In a way, they are betraying their own commitment to the nation.
Yes, and what some would say is that people are looking for the job after the administration, and being close to the powerful enhances that. I don't think it's quite that selfish.
Yes.
I actually think that the power that exists in the financial sector vis-a-vis the media and vis-a-vis perceptions of success, failure, goodness, badness, means that someone who's, say, a Treasury Secretary is very dependent upon his image in public relations. If J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs go out and hire PR firms to do what you might call negative information, they can tarnish a person's reputation. So at some level, they might be just deterred from doing things in regulation that make these people mad because they don't want the negative image that comes from...
But what about the negative image originated by the fact that they don't serve the people,
Yes.
which they are supposed to do? Because in the end, it is their place in history if this story is ever be told, which is at stake.
Yes, and I think in the long term, that loss of reputation is a very real risk for Barack Obama and the members of administration. And yet, in the very short term, I don't see the mainstream media raising these questions very often.
So precisely, why is it that mainstream media is not? Because in a way, mainstream media has the civic responsibility of truly informing people, or it has to bring clarity on complex issues, and yet, when you look at economic channels or channels dealing with business, you don't have the feeling that they offer this kind of clarity. So why is it that somehow one has to think that perhaps they have traded access, or they have chosen access over integrity?
Yes. There seem to be two ways of making news. One is investigative reporting, real, getting under the fingernails and digging it up. The second is access to leading officials. And these companies, many of which are in trouble in the stock market, are declining. The New York Times is under threat, Wall Street Journal stock prices down. Many of these have resorted to access journalism as their lifeblood,
Yes.
because it's too expensive to do real investigative reporting. But that makes them much more dependent upon policy officials, because they have to be able to sell every day that they get the story first. And as a result, they become quite dependent and therefore reluctant even to put editorials that
Yes.
challenge or contradict these people.
But what about once again, it's going to be
the civic responsibility.
Yeah, the civic responsibility, the sense of integrity, which is supposed to be at the very core of journalism.
I think that that's an important dimension. I think the fact that so many newspapers and media organizations are closing in the United States is like drawing down the shades when what we need is more sunshine. And we are losing some of the vitality of our democracy right now.
So in fact, what you're describing is at the top a relatively incestuous system or a system of revolving doors, in the context of which there is a bubble from which the rest of the country is disconnected, and
Yes.
a bubble which doesn't serve the country.
That's right.
So, we are told again and again that in order to solve this problem, we need people who have who have an inside knowledge of the banking system, and all this as a way to tell us that it's good to have people who go back and forth between Wall Street and Washington. What do you think of this state of affairs? Do you think that it doesn't create? Don't you think that it creates conflicts of interest? And how do you balance this danger of conflicts of interest with the need to have an inside knowledge to really reform
Yes.
what is to be reformed?
It's like the old saying, you never want to have somebody be your doctor
Yes.
that's never operated before.
Yes.
You want them to be seasoned
Absolutely.
and understand the structures and the
But how do you
expertise.
balance this?
But you need also to know that there is integrity in who they represent, how the expertise is employed. And you've recited several times in the few moments we've talked this notion of responsibility, integrity, common goal. When you
Yes.
go into public service, that is the mission you take on. And I find that that's what you might call that aspect of the heart
Yes, absolutely.
is not being elevated in the American system now. And it's quite painful to observe.
So what to do about this? I mean, in terms of regulation, in terms of having the political sphere monitoring better the financial sector, so that the whole nation doesn't become, in a way, the whole world doesn't become the captive or the hostage of a situation. Right. What to do?
What to do? I think people who are not used to being involved in the inside game of the political process have to measure the extent of this crisis. Places like Detroit, the state of Ohio, the state of California, in the United States are going into a very deep crisis. People need to get enraged and active. I don't mean enraged in terms of doing things that are just gratuitous violence. They have to become purposeful. They have to channel that energy into civic participation. In essence, they have to scare politicians that if they don't do the right thing, they'll be removed.
And how can they do that? Because in essence, you're telling us that the political system is really responding to the pressure of the powerful, and
Yes.
that the powerful is really running the show, and the others are really bystanders.
But I also mentioned to you that these media companies are declining. They're declining in part because the American people don't believe in them anymore. If you do surveys of college-educated kids, kids at Ivy League schools, kids at very creative liberal arts schools, they don't read the major newspapers now because they don't think it contains any truth.
So where do they get the information?
Off of the internet.
But I mean, do you think that the internet has the power to mobilize? I remember in the 90s, CNN was playing a very, very important role in terms of global diplomacy as a way to exercise pressure on member states, on the UN, to really have things being done in the Balkans, for instance. And so really CNN was a global actor in terms of making things happen. Do you think that the internet has the power to mobilize and bring people together to a certain effect?
What I think the internet has the ability to do is to criticize and make interactive what you might call pronouncements of the elite. A man like David Broder at the Washington Post or Thomas Friedman at the New York Times used to have a one-way street in his life. Now the internet barrages them with criticism whenever they make an argument that is unmindful of, say, all of the consequences. So you do have that capacity. Where the internet has a much harder time, I say they're good at being a critic, but at being a focal point of initiation, it is too small and too diffuse in many ways for people to rally around it as what you might call center of political inspiration. So I don't see that we have found what used to be, say, the case for CBS News in the United States. But I also think this is a global problem. This crisis, which emanated from New York and the United Kingdom, City of London, has spilled over all over the world. And part of what we tried to do in this UN conference was to point out that when you send things to the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, the Financial Stability Forum, the G7 or now the G20, it's still the same club of bankers. And that the representation of many of the people who are hurt by these outcomes of this crisis are not at the table. So the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, once again, reflect the power of New York and London. And these things need to change in order to have our society.
Yeah, but how do you break away from this? Because in fact, what you are telling us here is that a very strong connection between the sense of legitimacy of a political system, or the sense of illegitimacy of the system, and what is viewed as a legitimate intellectual discourse.
Yes.
I mean, earlier in the conversation, you talked about prestigious university chairs. And I guess that you meant that these chairs were used as a way to validate a certain vision of what the right economic track is. So how do you break away from this?
I think the contradictions between the evidence that we see and the elite affirmation of the existing system is very plain for people to see. And what I guess I would say is I expect the mainstream media to continue to try to validate the system. I expect the leaders in the government to be hesitant to reform. But the depth of the crisis is such that they are losing power by not changing, by not evolving. And we will experience more crisis.
Are you sure of this? Because, I mean, in the conversation which preceded this interview, you mentioned that, I mean, we were talking about the fact that, in a way, when you listen to the governments in America and Europe, to media, we are being told that we are now reaching the end of the crisis. Yet you were telling us, well, in fact, the crisis is probably deepening. So how do you go against this PR campaign telling us, well, things are getting better?
Well, first of all, when we had a new president, as we talked about earlier, there is a time when he's supposed to come in and make great change. So the financial institutions bandied together to say, the crisis is over, there's no need for drastic change. And they are trying to get past that window of time where it is a new administration. But in essence, by not repairing things in the crisis, who is it? It's the head of the White House, Rahm Emanuel, who says a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Be careful when the head of the White House says something, because it is he that is wasting this crisis. It's kind of ironic that he would make that comment, and then they would avoid significant structural reforms.
And yet, to a very large extent, once again, I'm not an economist, but as a regular, onlooker citizen, one has the impression that the administration is, by and large, going along with what Wall Street wants.
Yes.
So how can you, on the one hand, warn people, and yet, on the other hand, go along?
Well, I think they're going along because of power, but they have to be reelected in 4 years. And when they came into office, Mr. Bush owned this crisis.
Yes.
4 years from now, if they haven't cleaned it up, they will own this crisis.
But don't we have a risk of having precisely the cosmetic changes prevailing over the need for deep change? Because there is a PR campaign going on, telling us that everything is okay, everything is going to be okay, and yet you were telling us a moment ago that things are quite bad and they're going to become worse. So how do you overcome the forces pushing forward this PR campaign?
Well, I think you overcome it, unfortunately, in time with events. The contradictions between the PR campaign and the experience of people as the unemployment rate continues to rise, as businesses fail, and as banks return to fail. Many of the banks took a very dangerous plan when they returned the government support money, because if things turn back down in the next year or two, they will have to come back to the government.
So precisely, tell us a bit of what you see as a possible, perhaps even likely scenario for the future in terms of the worsening, the deepening of the crisis. So what has been done in terms of management of the crisis has been basically a stimulus package. So how do you see things unfolding in the coming months, and what is your prognostic as where we will be, for instance, in a year's time?
First of all, with regard to financial reform, they have not done very much, and the big institutions will still be prone to taking too much risk and running the risk of another meltdown, another collapse. Secondly, the stimulus program is very backloaded. What I mean by that is it will come on stream largely next year before the midterm election, because Obama gave Congress the license to what you might call design the stimulus program. Congress did exactly what you would expect them to do. They designed it to create the most stimulus just before they go back to the voting booths.
Yes.
But it's in year 3 of Obama's administration, when the stimulus plan is gone, when people are complaining because debt is so high, when the bank bailout, they didn't need to use taxpayer money to bail out the banks.
So why did they call upon
They could have adjusted the debt, the so-called unsecured debt of the banks. They could have written that down.
So why did they call upon taxpayers' money?
Because it was easier than taking on the wealthy and powerful people in America.
Yeah, but down the road, the political risk for this,
the political risk
there will be a day of reckoning.
Is that down the road, and I call it year 3 of Obama, they will have a much higher debt ratio, and they will be asked to cut the deficit, and that runs the risk, just like Roosevelt did in 36 and 37, just like the Japanese did in the late 1990s, send the economy back down into a deeper slump again.
And what would have been an alternative path?
In my opinion?
Yes.
I would have forced debt equity conversion on the resolution of the banks. I would have given the stock in the banks to the public treasury, so when the banks regain their health, the people who put up the money would get something in return. That would make the public budget much less. With regard to the stimulus program, much less in the way of tax cuts, much more in the way of public investment, long-term durable investment, so that after you get done on the spending on the projects, which create jobs and create what they'll call Keynesian stimulus, the longer term would leave in place things that had enhanced our productivity, modernization of airports, a high-speed rail system in the United States, better roads, better bridges, better schools, better hospitals.
And basically, these recommendations are also the ones put forward by Professor Stiglitz, Professor Krugman, and so on. So, which leads me to another question: why is it that in America, while you are having so many brilliant minds when it comes to economics and so on, why is it that it's only a small and close circle of people who are really advising the president on these matters?
Well,
why not bring to the table, why not opening up the circle of conversation, of discussion, if you will?
Well, when I go back to my question of money in politics, Geithner and Summers are very bright guys. Stiglitz and Krugman are very bright guys. Stiglitz and Krugman are talking about what benefits society. Geithner and Summers are entrusted with what gets Obama reelected. And the difference is in who's represented. Stiglitz, Krugman represent the entire population. Geithner and Summers tend to disproportionately represent those in power in the private sector. When I say those in power, I don't mean government officials. I mean the people who support government officials, people like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley.
And who? So in a sense, you are telling us that these companies, these corporations play a key role in the election of or the election and re-election of officials.
In this last election, John McCain was the leader in the Republican Party. Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were very close in the Democratic Party. Goldman Sachs and Company was organized by place of work, one of the top 3 donors for all 3 of them. In the top 20 of each of those 3 people I mentioned, McCain, Clinton, and Obama, in the top 20, more than 10 were financial companies in all 3 cases. So they play a very important role.
So as a way to conclude our conversation, what do you expect from the upcoming UN conference on the economic crisis? I mean, should we be optimistic? Should we be pessimistic?
It is my opinion that the rest of the world understands that this malfunction in governance in the United States and the UK has hurt everyone. And I would expect them to demand a greater voice, changes in international institutions, and to continue, if you might say, to discredit the system that the Americans, the British, to some extent the Swiss and the Germans have supported.
So how do we make this happen? How do we exercise pressure? How do we, generate change?
Making noise, having intellectual examples like Krugman and Stiglitz, leading other people into a sense of public service, and just as, how would I say, you've spent some energy today talking about civic duty, and it's a great concern to you. The louder you get, what you have to envision is that there is an audience. There are people all over the world with these kinds of feelings in their heart. And what Malcolm Gladwell, the author, calls the tipping point. Right now, it seems very dark, but it's always darkest before the dawn. If people like yourself and Joseph Stiglitz and me keep fighting, maybe it'll catch some momentum. And
that's what Professor Chomsky told us last week in our interview.
It's been a very dark period for a very long time in the United States. From really 1980 to the present, I kept being surprised that things deteriorated further and further. Whether on Bush administration, the question of torture was an abominable experience. To be an American citizen traveling abroad and understand that these were the policies, this was the ethic of American administration, was very embarrassing. I worked very hard on making a movie called Taxi to the Dark Side about that. And little did I know we'd go from the darkness of foreign policy to the darkness of financial policy. But at some level, unless in the medium term, Mr. Obama, who asked everyone, don't be cynical, we can turn the corner, unless he actually shows us to be turning the corner, unless he engages in what you might call the courage rather than the calculation, his heroic status will diminish. I think he's a smart guy. I think he'll change course, but it may take a little more pain before he leads us.
So we shouldn't give up on the fight.
We should keep reminding him that we're in pain, not give up on the fact, and expect him to respond when his own future success and legacy are in the balance.
Mr. Johnson, thank you for your time. Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your insights. I am Jean-Marc Coicot from the United Nations University, and you were watching a conversation on the economic crisis and all kinds of issues having to do with regulation, power, and media. Thank you for watching.